One of the things we learned in genetics is that we need massive numbers of people to identify genetic variants that predict our risk of depression. We thought that 10,000 would be enough, but we're actually learning that we need hundreds of thousands of people to be able to participate in studies and help us do that. So I just want to use this also as an opportunity to say that if you have a chance to participate in a research study, it would sure mean a lot to our field to be able to do that, and we really need as many people to participate as possible. I'm really excited to be here. And as Daryl said, I'm happy to take any questions throughout. I have about 30 minutes of prepared comments that I'll give, but I'm happy to deviate from that. I really want this to be as engaging and interesting to you as possible. So one of the things that Daryl had asked me to do was to tell you a little bit about how I got into the work that I do. So I actually started my career as a teacher. I thought that if you wanted to promote healthy child development, one of the best ways to do that was to teach. So this is a picture of me when I was working at a second grade classroom at the Josiah Quincy Elementary School here in Boston. I spent several years working not only in elementary school classrooms, but I also worked in Head Start classrooms in the city of Boston and elsewhere. One of the things that I was struck by in my work in classrooms was that I always noticed that students seemed to come into the classroom with a range of risk and protective factors, or a range of things that influence their ability to learn. The things that struck me most were exposure to adversity and the mental health problems that seemed to go inside with that. So with respect to adversity, I was seeing that even as young as preschool children were experiencing within their families, within their parents, exposure to a whole host of things that would be remarkable for any of us to experience, but truly remarkable for someone of such a young age to experience. Things like death of a parent or a loved one, exposure to terrible abuse, really severe poverty, and things of this sort. And what I also started to notice was that these kinds of exposures to stress and adversity seem to be patterned with a range of different mental health problems, not only in the children that I was working with in classrooms, but also their parents and families. And that's got me, at that point I started thinking, you know, I think my skills are probably better used to actually not teach and to figure out how I can go about reducing exposure to adversity in the service of trying to prevent mental health problems in kids. So that's how I got to be doing what I'm doing. As Daryl said, I am an epidemiologist, which is a term that might be new to some of you. So let me take a little bit of time and tell you more about what I do as an epidemiologist. So we work in large samples of the population. So we don't necessarily study people in a clinic, but we're interested in studying people in the larger community. And one of the first things that we do is we try to understand, well, how many people are experiencing the problem that we're interested in? So how many people are actually exposed to adversity, and how many people have mental health problems as well? We also then try to identify factors, risk and protective factors, that are linked to those health problems. So what are the kinds of things that make it more likely that someone will experience a mental health problem? And what are the things that will make it less likely for someone to experience a mental health problem? We also try to understand the mechanisms that explain risk for mental disorders. So how is it that exposure to something like adversity gets into our bodies to change our brains and to change our behavior and other things that influence our risk of having mental health problems? And finally, what we're interested in doing is using all of this knowledge to ultimately help develop interventions and policies so that we can prevent the onset of mental health problems. So this is what we do in epidemiology, and this is what I'm passionate about doing as an epidemiologist. So most of my work so far has focused on depression, and let me tell you a little bit about depression for those of you who might not know about it. So it's a disorder that is defined by a range of different symptoms. So the classic symptoms of depression, so to speak, are feeling depressed mood or having loss of interest or pleasure in things. So things that you might have normally enjoyed doing, you suddenly don't like doing anymore. People often experience feelings of guilt or low self-worth. They also might have sleep or appetite problems. Sometimes these go in different ways. So sometimes people overeat and oversleep. Sometimes people undereat and undersleep. Loss of energy, poor concentration, and thoughts of death are also common. One of the things that I want to make sure that I emphasize is that the kind of depression that I'm talking about is a depression that's really disabling and that interferes with people's ability to function. So all of us experience depressed mood from time to time. But what I'm talking about is the kind of depression when people can't get out of bed, they can't go to work, they can't go to school, they don't feel like they can have meaningful relationships with other people. So that's what I mean by depression. There's a number of different specific types of depression. So you might have heard about major depressive disorder. That's the kind of depression that I'm talking about that lasts for a certain period of time. People also talk about something called dysthymia, which is where you have some of these symptoms but at a lower level. You might have also heard about seasonal affective disorder. So sometimes people experience these symptoms of depression around the changing of seasons and when we fall back on the clock. And it's also related to bipolar disorder. And for that, we often see people have experiences of mania that are coupled with bouts of depression. Given that we're in the holiday spirit, I also want to acknowledge that for a lot of people, people often tend to feel a little depressed also at the time of year and talk about the holiday blues. That's a little bit different than what I'm talking about, but I do want to acknowledge that these symptoms of depression and really having some mood changes might be common around this time of year. And I also want to say that one of the things that makes depression so hard to study is that we don't have a blood test for it. We can't measure it objectively. So we use what's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and we have experts rate people and through structured interviews determine whether people actually meet criteria for depression. So one of the things we also know from the epidemiology of depression is that it's a major public health issue. So we know that it is common throughout the lifespan. About 1 out of every 5 people will experience an episode of depression at some point in their life. We also know that depression is a disorder that disproportionately affects women. So girls and boys experience similar levels of depression during childhood, but something happens in adolescence where girls start to outpace boys by a ratio of 2 to 1, and that difference persists across the lifespan. We also know that depression is associated with a whole host of negative consequences. It affects people's ability to work, so there's lots of years of lost productivity. In its potentially most extreme form, it's associated with things like suicide, huge financial strain and family strain, and also associated with drug abuse. And these are just some of the many consequences. And it's also a disorder that, given these things, given how common it is, given how disabling it is, it's one of the leading causes of disability worldwide. So, and you can also see what I'm showing here are some of the estimates of how common depression is across the globe. So in Japan, about 6.6% of the population it can be diagnosed with having depression, compared to about 21% in certain parts of Europe. So it's very common. It's very high. One of the things we know is that exposure to stress and adversity is one of the most potent risk factors for depression. So there are a number of different adversities that I experienced or I witnessed when I was working in my Head Start and other classroom settings. For the rest of my talk, I want to tell you more about work that's been done specifically on child abuse and neglect. So one of the things that we know is that maltreatment, along with other types of traumas, are really common and also socially patterned in the population. So one of the things that has been done is to go out and to use large samples in the community and to ask people, well, how did you experience a range of these kinds of traumas? And if so, when did you experience them? So what I'm showing here are results of a study that was conducted back in 2010 where an investigator named Ron Kessler at Harvard Medical School did a survey of the entire US population. Took a sample of the US population and in about 10,000 people said, how common is exposure to adversity and trauma? What you can see in the top line here is that about 40% of people report having been exposed to any one of those things that I've listed here. So any type of assaultive violence or any other injury or shocking experience. And one of the things that I want to emphasize about this is that this is not exposure necessarily in adulthood. This is the prevalence or how often people are exposed to these types of traumas by age 13. So these are really common experiences that happen to a large segment of our population very early on in the life course. We also know, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, is that exposure to adversity is also socially patterned. So here's an example where we see that women are more likely to be exposed to assaultive violence, which includes things like rape or sexual assault, compared to men. This is really concerning because we know that childhood maltreatment is one of the biggest risk factors for depression. So what I'm showing here are the results of a study that I did using that same data set that I just described in a large population-based sample of people living in the US. And what I wanted to know was, well, exactly by how much does the risk of depression increase if you're exposed to adversity? And how does that change over the life course? So in the first bars that you can see, so I'm looking, so on the x-axis, I'm plotting the results for 4 types of maltreatment: physical abuse, sexual assault, rape, and witnessing violence. And I'm looking at that in relation to the odds of having an episode of major depression by age 18. So if you look in the first bars, what you can see is that exposure to each type of violence is significantly increasing the odds of having depression in the same year in which you're exposed. So in other words, the 7.81 for physical abuse means that people who are first exposed to physical abuse have about 8 times the risk of developing depression in that same year in which they were physically abused. And you can see similarly high odds ratios across all of the other types of adversity. But what's also interesting is that in the years after exposure, there's still an elevated risk of having depression. So in other words, being exposed to these types of maltreatment not only immediately increases your risk of having a mental health problem, but it increases your risk for years to come. I think because it's modeling it's looking at the relationship between being exposed in that first year compared to everything in subsequent years. So we might expect that the risk of having depression would be greatest shortly after you're exposed to a type of adversity. It doesn't go away.
I'm sorry, can you just repeat those questions? I can't
sure.
hear them back here.
Sure. So the question is, why does it decrease dramatically from the first to the second time point that I'm showing? So it does, but it still means that, so the way that I interpret it is that in that initial year in which someone's exposed, they have a huge risk. They have 8 times the risk of having depression compared to someone who wasn't exposed. But even in those years after exposure, they still have twice the risk. Yeah. So it's
Why don't they have 4 times the risk? Why is it only 2? It seems like a year later, or is it just something that's having to do?
Yeah, so the question is, why is it that it's dropping off? So I think that, well, a couple of things. I think one is that we're just looking at the risk of depression by age 18, so we're not accounting for what's happening over people's lives. But I also think that 2 times the risk is still a huge risk. So I think relative to the effect in the initial year, it might seem small, but it's actually really large.
I agree with that. I'm just wondering,
Yeah. I don't think we know, yeah, I don't think the thing that I think is most consistent that we find across any study is that we see a significant risk. And I think to some extent as scientists, we see a twofold risk and think that's a big risk. So in some ways, we don't necessarily differentiate a fourfold and a fivefold and a sixfold risk. If we could do something to reduce risk among people who are exposed to adversity, we'd see a huge impact because even having twice the risk is still a large risk. But I appreciate what you're saying, that it does seem like it's dropping off a bit. Exactly. Well, it could be a slope, or it could be something else, which I'll tell you a little bit more about. These are great questions, and definitely keep them coming. So one of the things that I hope I can convince you of is that in order to prevent depression, we've really got to think about this from a multidisciplinary approach. We can't just think of genes, we can't just think of exposure to adversity, but we've really got to think of a range of different things. So one of these kinds of graphs that I often find really helpful is the one that I'm showing here, because I think it nicely reminds us of all of the different ways that we can be thinking about how to prevent depression. So everything from genetic factors to individual level environments, so that might include things like our socioeconomic resources, our personality, things of this sort, to our social relationships, to our living conditions, housing, neighborhoods and communities, the institutions that we live in, so that we live and work in, so schools, our workplaces, all the way up to social and economic policies at the local, state, and national level. So the focus of my research laboratory and about the work that I'm going to tell you about tonight is organized into three primary areas. So the first question that I'm interested in understanding is, which children are most susceptible to the effects of adversity? Are there some kids who might be more susceptible to adversity? The second question is, are there stages in the lifespan when adversity is particularly harmful? We talk about these as potential sensitive periods, which I'll tell you about more. And then the third is, how is it that adversity actually gets under the skin? So how is it that this external stressor actually gets into our bodies to increase our risk for depression and other kinds of negative health outcomes? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to walk you through each of these three areas. And again, feel free to interrupt with any questions. I'm happy to take them along the way. And if you're listening to this on Facebook Live, I'm also happy to take questions, so feel free to bring those in. So the first I'll tell you about is work looking at trying to identify which individuals are more vulnerable or susceptible to the effects of stress. So one of the things that I think is interesting to think about is around the question of why might there be individual differences in response to adversity. And how I got to be thinking about this was that anytime I would do a study, I would plot my data like any good scientist would do. So I would put something on the y-axis, levels of depression, and I would look at that in relation to a count of exposure to adversity. And I would plot my data, and it would look something probably like this. And I would run a fancy statistical regression, and I would get some estimate of effect, so twice the risk, 3 times the risk, something like that. But what I started realizing as I was doing this is that I was missing out on 2 really important features of this data. One was that I wasn't taking account of people like the one that I have circled who have really high depressive symptoms with only a small amount of adversity. And at the same time, I also wasn't considering people like at the bottom corner who have really low levels of depressive symptoms despite having a lot of adversity. So one of the things that got me wondering about is, well, how can we explain these individual differences? Why is it that some people, when they're exposed to some type of adversity, have very different responses? So one of the things that I've been interested in looking at is genetic variation and how our genes may play a role in shaping risk for depression. And the reason that I've been interested in this is because we know that depression has at least partly a genetic component. So the table that I'm showing is showing what are called heritability estimates. So the way that I think about heritability is that imagine we have a pie, and we could divide that pie into different proportions. And we say how much of this pie could be due to genetic variation. So how much of this pie within the population could be due to genes, and how much is explained by other factors. So what we find at a population level, so a sort of population pie, is that about 40% of the variability in depression is due to genetic variation. So depression is about 40% heritable. You can see that the heritability of depression is lower relative to other psychiatric disorders. So it's highest for things like schizophrenia, but 40% is still a large percent for us to be thinking about potentially doing something with. So one of the things that we as a field have been doing over the last decade has been to perform what are called Genome-Wide association studies. Out of curiosity, has anyone heard of these before? Okay, a few people, that's great. So for those of you who aren't aware, I can tell you a little bit more about it. So essentially what you do in a genome-wide association study is that you're looking in a particular person at the number of what are called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. So imagine if we were to take our entire DNA sequence and line it out from end to end. You can see in the top right, you can see the DNA sequence depicted here. So what a SNP is it's basically a single base pair change in the DNA sequence. So instead of having a C at that sequence, someone has a T. And so what we do in a genome-wide association study is we look at across the genome, so across a million different base pairs, how many of these SNPs occur, and whether they're more common among people who have depression compared to people who don't have depression. And what I'm showing on the bottom plot is what we call a Manhattan plot. And on that Manhattan plot, we have chromosomes are listed out on the x-axis, and the y-axis is corresponding to test of statistical significance, corresponding to the association between each of these SNPs and risk for depression. So all of those teeny little dots are actually plotting all of the SNPs, 5 million SNPs that we're looking at in our study. And as you might imagine, based on the name, when we see a lot of signal going on, we see skyscraper type effects start to emerge from the data. So in a really good Manhattan plot, where we're seeing genetic signal in specific areas of the chromosome, we start to see skyscraper-like effect emerge from the data. And when we don't see any signal, we call them Dutch plots, because if you've been to the Netherlands, it's very flat. That's probably the only joke I'll tell tonight. So one of the things that we're doing now in the field is performing studies where we can look at not only the results of these genome-wide association studies, but that we can also pair them with with information about exposure to a range of different environments to be able to help identify whether there are some vulnerability or sensitivity genes. So the way that you can think about this is that imagine that we have some environment that we're measuring that ranges from low risk to high risk. And similarly, we are looking at depressive symptoms that also range from low to high symptoms. So we could say, let's look at people who have 3 different genotypes. So everyone in the population could be grouped into being in one of 3 different genotype groups. So we might find that if we were to do a study that people in the genotype C group, so in our 3rd genotype group, kind of doesn't matter what kind of environment they're in. Their level of depressive symptoms is going to be the same. That's a different story from the genotype A group, where at low levels of environmental risk, they have very low levels of risk for depression. But at high levels of the environmental risk, they also have high levels of depression. And then there's also, we might imagine, folks who would be somewhere in between. And there was a really interesting metaphor that was put forward that was described in a piece in The Atlantic that came out a while back that talked about this genotype C group as being dandelions. So if there's any gardeners out there, these are folks who are hardy. They do well regardless of the environments they're in. And then there are orchids. So some of us might be more orchids. We do really well when we're nurtured, when we're taken care of, but we have a more sensitive disposition. So in other words, in really good environments, we do very well, but in very poor environments, we do poorly. Yes?
So you just mentioned nurture. Does nurture factor into your studies?
Yes, that's a great question. So the question is, how does nurture fit into the studies that we've been pursuing so far? So what I would generally say is that for the most part, we often look at exposure to bad things. So we're looking at exposure to adversity. But we also know that those happen to people who sometimes that adversity, as you said, a parent will die, and there will be tons of loved ones who will come in and provide a lot of support to the child. And that's a really different circumstance than the child who has a parent die and who is completely alone. When we're studying this, we generally try to account for that. So in other words, when we perform our statistical analysis, we say, what is the effect of parent death after we exclude out all of these potential things? So in other words, we try to make those adversities as equivalent as possible. And so this is meant to provide not an actual data example, but a hypothetical example for how we would think about studying these kinds of relationships, and to give an example of the kinds of research projects that scientists are working on.
Will those nuances be looked at further in your upcoming slides?
You know, for the most part, I tend to focus a lot on exposure to adversity. So that will be most of what I'll focus on. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Is it possible to have depression but not asymptomatic? Does that make sense?
So is it possible to be depressed but asymptomatic?
Yeah, you're going to depression.
So that's one of the, I'm glad you asked that question. So the question is really about the definition of depression. And so I think people tend to either classify people as either being depressed or not depressed. I tend to like all of the middle. So I tend to look at depressive symptoms and tend to look at measures that tell us something about how people are functioning, so that we can get to more of that kind of continuum and not just put people into clear boxes of whether people are depressed or not. Does that answer your question? Yeah, and this is what makes it so challenging for the work we do, is because we have to rely on people telling us. So there has to be some level of insight that people have when they're answering questions about their symptoms, or they're telling a clinician about their experiences. So there's always the potential that we might be missing something. But I would imagine that in a case like that, we might get we would pick up some experience of symptoms, but maybe just not. It would be a sort of low level of depression, but without having those functional impairments. Yeah, that's great. So the comment was about being able to do, I think, more sophisticated studies where we could look at people more daily and over more frequent periods of time. Folks are actually starting to do that now. So we're using things like smartphone apps and things of this sort to track progress in treatment response, seeing if people use not only whether they're on Facebook and sort of what they're doing and how they're reporting symptoms when asked, but also how much are they using their phone, how much are they picking it up, what kind of movements are happening, and things of that sort. So that kind of work is definitely underway. That's another great question. So question is about whether we can use statistical techniques like risk prediction modeling to be able to help determine whether someone might have depression. So that's something that the field is also definitely doing. I think some of the most exciting work around that is coming in areas like suicide, for example, because what we know is that clinicians aren't always the best at being able to identify people who are at risk of suicide, and also it's highly stigmatizing and people don't want to report whether they're suicidal. So a lot of what folks are doing is a combination of machine learning. So for example, can we see different patterns emerging within someone's electronic health record that might be able to tell us about whether they might be suicidal? Or can we do kind of implicit measures testing, so where we might pair a positive word and a negative word and see that that person might have a bias towards words that are associated with death and things of this sort. So that's another area that is definitely very active in research, and there's a lot of great people doing that at Mass General. So the plot that I'm showing here was trying to provide an example of how we might think about looking at the interaction between genes and environment. But it doesn't plot, this isn't specific for 3 people. This just might be what the data looks like. We could find a number of different patterns in this in any study. So we might find that there are some people who, are high or at any variation. But what we might generally find is something along these lines in terms of what we would expect around how environments might manifest in different ways. And generally, this is also what has been found in relation to looking at exposure to childhood maltreatment and risk for depression. So a couple of comments about what scientists are doing and learning in this area. So in addition to some of the things I mentioned about current research in the field, lots of work to do genome-wide association studies. So we've now identified about 100 SNPs that are associated with depression. This was super exciting for us as a field because it took us a really long time and took us massive amounts of people to be able to identify these 100 SNPs. There's still a lot of work that's actively underway, and really this work is just beginning in some ways. We're also doing studies to evaluate the role of environments and how environments modify genetic susceptibility to depression. And I think some of the major take-home points that we're learning so far is that your genes aren't deterministic. So just because you might carry a gene that might predispose you to have depression does not necessarily mean that you will have depression. We know that environments are important, and we also know that there is a balance of genes that confer risk and also genes that might confer protection. We also know that your environments are also not deterministic. So just because you might have grown up in a challenging family circumstance doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to have mental health problems. There's also lots of risk and protective factors. So it's that combination of nature and nurture that was pointed out earlier. Next, I want to tell you more about work that we've been doing to try to determine if there are ages when adversity is most harmful. So one of the things that I've been wondering about in doing this work is around how is it that childhood adversity might actually increase subsequent risk for depression. So we might think about this as emerging from a number of different ways. So we might think that, well, maybe it just has something to do with being exposed. So we might say it's an exposure model. So being exposed to adversity increases your risk of depression, and it's just not more complicated than that. We might also say, well, maybe it has something to do with accumulation. It has something to do with how much adversity you've had. So here we might posit that there's a dose-response relationship between how much adversity you've experienced and your risk of depression. The other thing we might also say is, well, maybe there are sensitive periods. In other words, maybe there are ages in the course of our lifespan when exposure to adversity is really potent in shaping our risk for depression. And I think being able to understand which of these theoretical models helps to explain the relationship between adversity and depression is really important because it's going to tell us about how to intervene. So if it's an exposure model, it suggests we just want to rid the world of that exposure. We want to intervene at any time, and we just want to reduce the number of people that are exposed to adversity. If it's something more of an accumulation model, it suggests that we want to intervene early. So we want to reduce the number of adverse things that happen to people. If it's more of a sensitive period model, it suggests that we want to intervene at that point of sensitivity, either at that point or shortly before, because that might be where our interventions would be most effective. So in this way, I think about sensitive periods as being high-risk periods. So they're potentially windows of vulnerability, but they might also be high-reward periods or windows of opportunity when our interventions might be more beneficial. Go ahead. Yes. So that's definitely true. So the comment was about what is the nature of exactly how adversity, the effects of adversity might change over time. So that is definitely true. And this is really something that people have not generally looked at yet. So this is what a lot of what my work is focusing on now, is trying to better understand these very early questions, and I think then be able to ask the kinds of more sophisticated questions that you're asking. So building from that, so this is the result of an analysis that I did using data from an epidemiological study where there were children who were sampled across the US based on their schools. And so this was a study where kids were asked, were you ever exposed to physical abuse and sexual abuse? And if so, how old were you when you were first exposed? So what we did was we then looked at the relationship between age at first exposure and the odds of having depression in adulthood. So what I'm showing here is the results of this analysis where we are comparing people who were first exposed at different time periods to those who were never exposed. And so what you can see here is that regardless of when exposure to adversity occurs, we see an increased risk of depression, specifically for physical abuse. But we also see that there are specific ages when exposure to physical abuse is most harmful. So for example, children who were first exposed in preschool have a higher risk of depression compared to children who reported being first exposed in adolescence. We find similar results for sexual abuse. So generally, if you're exposed to sexual abuse, you see an increased risk of depression, but there's also time periods where it seems that being exposed is even more potent. So here we find that being exposed at ages 6 to 8 is associated with a higher risk of depression compared to being exposed around ages 9 and 10. So what are scientists doing generally in this area? So this is, as I mentioned, really early days of this work. So we're starting to do, and what my research laboratory is doing a lot of, is trying to look at and examine developmental timing differences in the effect of exposure to adversity. Because generally as a field, we've just looked at whether or not people are exposed. And we're also trying to do experiments in animals to better understand what might be happening biologically that might trigger when these sensitive periods occur. So when are these developmental stages where we might expect there to be greater sensitivity to the environment? What we're generally learning from this work so far is that it's not just that you're exposed, but when you're exposed that seems to matter. We're also finding that there isn't a single sensitive period in the lifespan. So in other words, we generally think of the prenatal period as being really important, but it's not the only time period that's important. We think that there are multiple sensitive periods across the lifespan. The other thing that I also want to emphasize is that the outcomes that happen as a result of exposure to adversity and other kinds of traumas during sensitive periods might actually not be set in stone. I think the brain is remarkably plastic, and there's lots of opportunities to be able to promote that kind of plasticity or these brain changes throughout the lifespan. So I definitely don't want to leave anyone with the message that it's gloom and doom, that exposure during a sensitive period is necessarily something that can't be reversed. So finally, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we've been doing to try to understand how adversity actually gets under the skin. So this is a question that we've been wondering about. So what I've generally been talking about so far is, we see associations between exposure to adversity and depression, but there's a black box. How is it that this actually happens? So there's been a number of things that we've been trying to look at, things like how our cells function, brain structure and functioning, changes in behavior, and things of this sort. And I'll tell you a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing in this area. So one of the things that we've been looking at is called the field of epigenetics. And we've been looking at something called DNA methylation. And I'll explain this a little bit in more detail on the next slide. But DNA methylation is basically a change that happens, or it's when molecules get added to our DNA sequence that don't change our actual DNA sequence, but they change how our genes are expressed. So to give you an example, imagine this is your DNA sequence laid out. There would be these specific molecules that then get attached to your DNA that determine whether your genes are going to be turned on or turned off. So one of the ways that you can think about, if there's any musicians out there, is that you can think about the musical score that I have denoted here like our DNA sequence. So it's as if each musical note is like the sequence of our DNA. So if anyone's a musician, you might know that the way that I would play this particular score might vary from the way someone else might play that particular score. And I might decide to make notes or annotate this score so that I can play the music in a very specific way. So you might think about epigenetics as being those chemical modifications that happen to your DNA that change how your genes are expressed. In other words, the way that a musician can annotate the score to change how the notes are played. So this is the work that we've been doing most recently in the lab. What we're starting to find generally is that exposure to adversity is associated with a lot of these different DNA methylation changes, and that these are happening across the genome. So this is a Manhattan plot where we're looking at the differences in DNA methylation across a number of different chromosomes in response to a range of different exposures to adversity. So in this most recent case, we've been looking at not only maltreatment, but maternal depression, family instability, financial stress and poverty, and things of this sort. Generally, what we're finding is that most of the methylation changes, or the DNA methylation changes that we're seeing, are the result of being exposed to adversity early on in the lifespan. So we find more of these DNA methylation changes among people who were exposed to adversity during infancy compared to other stages in the lifespan. One of the things that we've also been starting to do, building from this work, is to try to understand what might be happening at a cellular level. So one of the things we've been looking at is a new measure that folks have developed in the field that looks at cellular aging. So you might imagine this as being able to compare your biological age to your chronological age. So, for example, someone might be considered to be normally aging, meaning their chronological age, so their age in years, is similar to their biological age. Some of us might be prematurely aging, where our biological age, or the age of our cells, is actually much older than we are chronologically. And then there might be some of us that are also really aging quite well, and where our chronological age is actually older than our biological age, and biologically we're younger than our chronological age. So we've been looking in one data set in particular out of Bristol, England, called the Avon Longitudinal Study of Parents and Children, which did a large epidemiological study in the county of Bristol in England. And one of the things that we've been finding when we look at this data is that we're finding that girls who are exposed to sexual abuse at age 3.5 are aging faster than their peers who are unexposed. So what we're finding is that by age 7, these girls are cellularly older than their unexposed peers by about 2 months. So this is early days for this work, but we think that it's interesting, and we're interested in looking out further in time to see whether we see these differences persist or whether we see them potentially get better with aging. So just to quickly comment on what scientists are doing and learning in this area. So we generally are looking at doing a number of studies to look at the multiple ways in which adversity can get into our bodies. So we're looking at not only these DNA methylation changes, but we're also looking at changes in inflammation, things that happen to the way that our brains are structured and the way they function, metabolic changes, hormonal changes, and many other things. There's multiple lessons learned. I think one of the most important things is that it's not all in your head, so to speak. So I think sometimes people will say, you know, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of attitude. You know, you can sort of change the way that you're dealing with things. Well, it might not actually be so easy to do that. These kinds of adversities leave biological memories behind that might affect how our bodies function. So this is my last slide, so I'll just summarize and provide a couple of take-home messages. So I think there are multiple ways that we can think about intervening to prevent depression. I think generally what we want to do as much as we can is reduce exposure to adversity, because hopefully I've convinced you that exposure to adversity is a major risk factor for depression. But I think once folks are exposed, there are a number of things that we can also do to help offset risk. I think one of the things we can try to do is identify people who might be high risk and then help get them better connected into treatment, so to speak, that could mitigate the consequences of exposure to adversity. And I don't necessarily mean psychological treatment, but I think there's a number of different kinds of treatments that could be beneficial. Treatments in quotes, so exercise, social support, nurturing, other things of this sort that could be really beneficial. I also want to make sure that I emphasize again that our biology matters, but it's not our destiny. So there's definitely a complex interaction between our genes and experience, and it's not a clear one-for-one. I also want to say that what we're learning is that the developmental timing of our experiences might be important. This is still really early days of this work, and if you're interested in following more of it, you'll definitely have my contact information at the end to keep up to date on what we're doing in our research lab. I think if I wasn't a scientist, I couldn't say this, but we always say this in science, is that we've learned a lot, but there's still a long way to go. So, and I think the other thing too is that it's going to take all of us to make progress. So one of the things we learned in genetics is that we need massive numbers of people to identify genetic variants that predict our risk of depression. We thought that 10,000 would be enough, but we're actually learning that we need hundreds of thousands of people to be able to participate in studies and help us do that. So I just want to use this also as an opportunity to say that if you have a chance to participate in a research study, it would sure mean a lot to our field to be able to do that, and we really need as many people to participate as possible. So with that, I'll just end quickly with some ideas if some of you are feeling like you need ideas about how to cope with holiday stress. Get enough sleep and exercise. This is great all year round. Avoid overspending. Don't focus on having the perfect holiday. Examine and then revise expectations. Don't be afraid to say no. I think another good thing to do all year round. And also limit alcohol consumption and enjoy treats in moderation. So with that, I'll just end by saying that the science that we do is certainly a global enterprise. These is a list of all of the collaborators that I've had the pleasure of working with over the course of my career. And as you can see, they come from all parts of the globe. And I'll just end by thanking members of my lab, including Katie Davis, who is here and helped me put together the slides for today, my funding support, including funding from the National Institutes of Health. And I'm happy to take any remaining questions that you have. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much. Sorry, I haven't heard him speak yet, so I'm gonna bring him back down here.
Great.
Thanks. I think, can you hear me okay like this? My question is about the dandelion group. So is there anyone or yourself, do you have data on the protective factors of that group that you could analyze in a similar way, and maybe you could account for the genetic component? I'm thinking about treatment and about behaviors of people who are resilient.
So most of what we've done in genetics so far is to really understand risk for disease. We are really just starting to look at what explains how people, despite having all sorts of bad things, actually don't end up having these diseases, whether depression or really anything else. So we're starting to do that. I think that the dandelion and sort of orchid and dandelion thing, I think, is a nice way of being able to help illustrate the points. But we don't exactly have the data yet to be able to help determine who is exactly a dandelion and who's an orchid. But we're starting to piece that together through things like genetic association studies. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
And if everyone could just use the mic, that would be great, because for our live audience and people back there, they can't hear. Sorry.
I had two questions. One, whether you had done any work with EMDR as a method to work with people with the trauma, and also all of your things were physical things. They were not the sort of bullying kind of thing, and I wondered if you had done any work with that at all.
Those are great questions. So since I'm not a clinician, I don't do any work with EMDR, but there's certainly lots of great people at Mass General who do. And bullying is also something that I have not done a lot of work with. You know, it's always tricky in science of how much you can actually take on. And I've been really most passionate about doing work related to child maltreatment based on what I saw in schools and based on other work that I did. So I've really chosen to try to be focused on that and do a good job there. But I know that there's lots of great people who are doing good work locally in bullying.
My question is just kind of a follow-up earlier. You mentioned the different kind of groups. You have 10,000, but you might need hundreds of thousands because of the different subgroups that are out there. And is there any cross-correlation with demographic groups, immigrants or people from different kind of ethnicities, and how it affects them as well? Because poverty obviously is one, but then there's institutionalized kind of, or maybe not institutional, but cultural and ethnic forms of treating stress or coping mechanisms that deal with stress, and how it gets expressed versus not expressed.
And are you thinking about that generally or specifically in the genetic context?
In the genetic context as well, because obviously a lot of ethnic groups have different kind of subgroups of DNA. And thinking about my own kind of cultural Soviet Jewish neurotic background, but also as a third-generation Holocaust survivor. And so there's a lot of kind of inherited depression, but there's also the resilience of being an immigrant. And so wondering kind of the cross-section of those different groups.
Yeah, so another great question. I think generally in the work that we've done in genetics, for the most part, we've been really limited to focusing on European ancestry populations. I'm really proud to say that I am one of the first people that's actually done work focusing on African Americans and Hispanics. So that work is starting to come together, and actually have on my to-do list for the start of the year to try to help as part of the efforts that I'm working on as part of a group called the Psychiatric Genomics Consortium, where we are literally going across the globe and saying who has data available that we can pull together to amass those hundreds of thousands people that we need to be able to look at this. So one of the things that we're going to be working on is trying to do that with non-white samples so that we can really understand what's common, what's different. The other piece too is I think that on the epigenetic end, we also know that a lot of it is inherited, and that these biological changes can have lasting consequences on not only the people that experience them, but on the people that are the offspring of those people who experience them. So I definitely don't want to end on that note, but that's one of the ways that people have also been starting to think about it. But I think one of the things that I have loved that we've had the chance to talk about and that I so appreciate is that our lives are so complex. It's really hard statistically to be able to account for that. So I think scientifically we take baby steps and we do a lot of this work incrementally so that we can try to understand and build on it. But I so appreciate the questions that have come about to try to acknowledge that complexity.
So we're over time, but we're going to take one last question and then wrap up.
So I definitely appreciate the insights from your work, but I'm wondering in terms of looking at adversity as a risk factor, it seems to me that adversity is inherent in, in our existence. We'll be walking about and then all of a sudden, our dog gets smushed by a car or something. It's the best example I could come up with off the top of my head. But I'm wondering whether we should have the conversation more centered around what makes somebody predisposed to be resilient towards adversity, because it's gonna happen in all of our lives.
I think some adversity is bound to happen to all of us, but I think things like child maltreatment shouldn't happen to any of us.
Right.
But I think you're completely right that it makes sense to try to understand how people respond to a range of different kinds of adversities. What's the sort of more normal or typical adversities that we as a society feel like we can live with? And what are the ones that we want to try to eliminate and reduce because no one should be experiencing them?
All right, thank you so much. Another round of applause for our speakers tonight.